That morning, the sky over northern France was covered by a veil of mist so thin that it was nearly impossible to tell where the ground ended and the air began. It was an unusually quiet morning, one in which the only sounds were the wind moving through open fields and the faint clink of metal as mechanics pulled an aircraft out of its hangar. The plane was painted a blazing red, so vivid that it seemed out of place against the gray, exhausted landscape of war, and even more out of step with the discretion fighter pilots usually sought. Manfred von Richthofen stood beside the aircraft, silently watching every step of the preparation. He did not speak much. He never did before takeoff. On the ground, he was a composed, courteous officer, almost cold in his restraint. But in the sky, his name had become a whispered warning. To Allied pilots, that red was more than paint. It was a signal, a message, a declaration that someone was hunting above them and had no intention of hiding. When the engine began to turn, its sound was not especially different from the hundreds of other aircraft that had taken off from these makeshift fields before. Yet those standing nearby understood that this moment was not like the others. A young ground crewman stepped aside, his eyes fixed on the scarlet fuselage, trying to memorize the image, though he could not explain why. In war, there are moments when human instinct recognizes that something extraordinary is unfolding. At low altitude, as the wheels lifted from the ground and the aircraft tilted gently to the left, Richthofen did not look down. He stared straight ahead, toward a sky that opened like an endless stage. Above him, other aircraft were already on patrol, small dark specks drifting between layers of cloud. There was no gunfire yet, no sign of combat. But everyone who had lived long enough in war knew that such silence never lasted. Elsewhere, not far away, a young British pilot checked his altimeter. He had never met Richthofen. He had only heard the stories. Rumors traveled faster than any official report. They said that if you saw a red airplane, the smartest move was to turn away immediately. They said the man flying it did not spray bullets wildly. He waited. He watched. And he fired only when he was certain. What made that fear different was not the number of victories recorded on a score sheet, but the cold deliberateness described by those who survived. Not frantic aggression, but precision. Not chaos, but lethal order. And most frightening of all was the fact that, in a vast sky, where men believed they could hide among clouds and wind, someone had chosen to make himself unmistakable. Yet this moment was not only about one man. It was about a deeper transformation unfolding above the trenches, a change the soldiers below had barely begun to sense. Only a few years earlier, airplanes were still fragile machines meant for observation, for mapping terrain, for spying on the enemy from above. They were not born to kill. At least, not at first. And then, somewhere between factories, technical drawings, and decisions that seemed purely mechanical, an idea emerged. A small solution to a very specific problem. But its consequences were anything but small. That idea turned the sky into a true battlefield, a place where human beings no longer merely observed death from a distance, but actively created it from a cramped cockpit, with a gun sight fixed straight ahead. On this mist-filled morning, as the red aircraft slowly vanished into the low clouds, no one on the ground thought about the manufacturing halls in Germany, or the drafting tables where a Dutch engineer had once bent over metal lines for hours on end. No one connected the fading engine sound to a tiny mechanism hidden between a spinning propeller and a machine gun. Yet that invisible connection was already shaping how human beings would kill one another in the sky. And somewhere between the clouds and the pale light of morning, A new era of warfare continued to operate without declarations, without trumpet calls. All it required was a red airplane, and an invention that had changed everything. Before the sky became a battlefield, before the red on an aircraft's wings turned into a symbol of fear, Anthony Fokker and Manfred von Richthofen were simply very young men, each carrying ambitions, insecurities, and limitations that their era would unintentionally elevate into legend. Neither of them was born with the intention of becoming an icon of war. Yet both grew up in a world changing too quickly, where technology, nationalism, and the urge to prove oneself fused into a force that was impossible to resist. Anthony Fokker was born in 1890 into a comfortable Dutch family where money was not a concern. But discipline was something he constantly pushed against. From an early age, Fokker showed that he did not fit into any formal educational system. He struggled with rules, lacked patience for textbooks, and frequently disappointed his teachers. At the same time, he was obsessed with machines, engines, gears, metal frames. Objects that seemed lifeless spoke to him in ways people did not. Fokker did not learn engineering in an academic sense. He tinkered, he experimented, he failed, and he tried again. When his family moved to Germany, Fokker found himself at the center of a simmering technological fever: aviation. In the early years of the 20th century, airplanes were still dangerous toys for the reckless. There were no standards, no safety regulations, only wooden frames, fabric skins, and underpowered engines struggling against gravity. To many, it was madness. To Fokker, it was opportunity. He did not merely want to fly. He wanted to control flight. He wanted to turn fragile machines into something repeatable, producible, improvable. Fokker began as a stunt pilot himself. He flew aggressively, recklessly, sometimes with little regard for his own life, not only to draw attention, but to understand the limits of aircraft. He knew that every abnormal engine vibration, every twist of the airframe in strong wind, was a lesson no book could teach. This blend of risk-taking and pragmatism set Fokker apart from many engineers of his time. He did not design ideal machines on paper. He built machines that could survive the sky, rough and imperfect as they were. Meanwhile, in a very different world, Manfred von Richthofen grew up under entirely opposite conditions. Born in 1892 into a Prussian aristocratic family, Richthofen was raised from an early age to become an officer. Discipline, honor, and service to the nation were not slogans, but the foundation of daily life. He learned to ride horses, to shoot, to obey orders, and most importantly, not to question them. In Prussian society, war was not merely conflict. It was ritual, a means of asserting status and personal worth. When the First World War broke out, Richthofen did not enter history as a pilot. Like many cavalry officers, he began on horseback, scouting and patrolling. But modern war quickly rendered everything he had been trained for obsolete. Trenches, machine guns, and artillery turned cavalry into a symbol of a vanished age. Horses had no place against barbed wire and concentrated firepower. For an ambitious young officer like Richthofen, this was more than disappointment, it was an identity crisis. It was during this period that the sky began to call to him. At first, airplanes were used only for observation. Pilots were not considered true warriors. They flew behind the lines, took notes, captured photographs, and returned. But Richthofen saw in the air something the trenches no longer offered: individuality. In the sky, there were no dense formations, no anonymous ranks. Each aircraft was a single person. Each encounter was a duel. When Richthofen transferred to the air service, he was not immediately an exceptional pilot. He learned slowly, and was even judged at times to lack agility. What he possessed instead was something fewer pilots had: cold observation and iron discipline. He did not fly on instinct. He analyzed. He waited. He approached combat as a hunt, where patience mattered more than recklessness. In his mind, every target was not an abstract enemy, but a problem to be solved. What connected Fokker and Richthofen was neither friendship nor personal sympathy, but a shared demand of their era. The German air service needed an advantage, and that advantage could not come from bravery alone. It required technology. It required a way to turn aircraft from eyes in the sky into real weapons. Early pilots tried firing pistols from cockpits, shooting at angles, firing sideways, even backward. But these were desperate improvisations, not solutions. Fokker, with the instincts of a mechanical problem solver, recognized the core contradiction. Firing straight ahead was most effective, but the propeller stood directly in the way. Many gave up at that point. For Fokker, it was not a wall but a doorway. He did not think about avoiding the propeller. He thought about synchronizing it, allowing each bullet to leave the bow. When war erupted in the summer of 1914, none of the great powers entered the conflict believing that the sky would become the decisive battlefield. General staffs trained in 19th century thinking still assumed that wars were won by infantry, artillery, and the ability to hold ground. Airplanes, in their view, were fragile machines, slow, unreliable, easy to bring down, useful for reconnaissance, not for combat. They were seen as nothing more than the artillery's eyes in the sky. The earliest flights over the battlefield were exploratory rather than combative. Pilots flew low enough to clearly see enemy formations, scribbling notes by hand, dropping scraps of paper with coordinates to artillery units below. There were no guns, no air combat tactics. When pilots encountered one another in the air, they often waved, sometimes even smiled. They were outsiders in a war where the real killing still happened on the ground. But modern war does not allow empty spaces to remain unclaimed for long. Within months, commanders realized that whoever controlled the sky controlled information. Whoever saw first would fire first. Whoever could conceal troop movements could save the lives of thousands of soldiers. From that moment on, airplanes were no longer neutral observers. They became targets. At first, pilots carried pistols, rifles, even bricks. They fired at one another in desperation, rather than with any real effectiveness. There were aerial gunfights in which the chance of hitting anything was nearly zero, yet the psychological shift had already occurred. When the first bullet truly brought down another pilot, the final taboo was broken. From that instant, the sky was no longer a shared space. It was divided between hunter and prey. At the same time, the ground below sank into an unprecedented stalemate. Trench lines stretched hundreds of kilometers from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Millions of soldiers were trapped in mud, barbed wire, and constant shellfire. Offensives consumed tens of thousands of lives for gains measured in mere hundreds of meters. In that context, every advantage, no matter how small, was desperately sought. Air power, once auxiliary, quickly became a place where nations pinned their hopes of breaking the deadlock. The problem was that technology lagged behind ambition. Aircraft of the time were light, underpowered, and structurally fragile. Adding weapons meant adding weight, reducing performance. And the greatest challenge remained unsolved: how to fire straight ahead when the propeller spun directly in front of the aircraft's nose. Many solutions were tried. Guns mounted to the side, guns mounted on the upper wing, steel plates attached to propeller blades to deflect bullets. All of them were temporary, dangerous, and imprecise. During this chaotic phase, Each side experimented in its own way. France and Britain leaned toward relative safety, accepting lower effectiveness to avoid catastrophic technical failure. Germany, constrained by resources and pressured on multiple fronts, was more willing to accept higher risk in exchange for temporary advantage. That difference in mindset opened the door to a dangerous leap forward. When the system that synchronized a machine gun with the propeller appeared, it was more than a technical improvement. It was a change in nature. Pilots no longer had to estimate, no longer had to fire at angles, no longer had to rely on luck. The airplane became a flying arrow, with firepower concentrated directly along its line of movement. In the hands of pilots who understood how to approach a target, this advantage was overwhelming. The consequences appeared almost immediately. Allied pilots began to vanish from the sky. Reconnaissance missions became lethally dangerous. No one fully understood what was happening, only that something new and deadly now ruled the air. In reports, phrases like German aircraft, firing with unusual accuracy, or attacked head-on, began to appear with growing frequency. This was not merely an arms race in the air. It was a race of thinking. Once one side grasped that the sky had become a true battlefield, the other was forced to adapt or be eliminated. Squadrons began to form. Group flying tactics emerged. The concept of the ace appeared. Pilots with exceptional victory counts, used not only as military assets but as symbols of morale. In this environment, air warfare developed a character very different from war on the ground. It was more personal. Each victory was tied to a single individual. Each loss was as well. There were no mass charges of thousands at once. Only a handful of aircraft twisting together in the sky, where decisions of life and death were made in seconds through skill, composure, and sometimes ruthlessness. It was within this context that figures like Manfred von Richthofen began to rise. Not as random products of propaganda, but as the logical outcome of a new environment, one in which when the first technical advantage appeared in the sky, it did not arrive as a warning, but as a promise. A promise that the war could be shortened. A promise that the stalemate on the ground could be broken if the right path were found in the air. But every promise in war carries a price, and that price is rarely visible at the beginning. Anthony Fokker's synchronization system, in its earliest months, was seen as a mechanical miracle. It granted the German air service a brief, but overwhelming window of dominance. A period in which the sky seemed to belong entirely to them. Victory reports multiplied. Enemy reconnaissance missions were cut down. Commanders on the ground felt the shift. Immediately, artillery fire became more accurate. Troop movements less likely to be detected. From the perspective of the general staff, this was not merely success, it was proof that technology might yet salvage a war that was sliding toward exhaustion. It was precisely here that the first mistake began to take shape. Temporary advantage was mistaken for lasting superiority. Instead of treating Fokker's invention as a breakthrough that required careful protection and gradual refinement, many came to see it as confirmation that they had found the key to victory. Pressure mounted on the people behind the technology. Fokker was pushed to produce faster, in greater numbers, sometimes before technical issues had been fully resolved. In war, time does not allow perfection. But the cost of haste is often paid later, in the lives of those who fly unfinished machines. For pilots, especially the young ones, technical advantage carried a dangerous temptation. When the gun fired straight and true, when the enemy seemed unable to respond in kind, a sense of invincibility crept in. New pilots began to believe that technology would protect them, that possessing the right aircraft was enough. Small errors in judgment formation discipline, weather assessment, engine conditions started to appear more frequently. Manfred von Richthofen, unlike many of his contemporaries, never fully trusted the protection of machines. Yet this placed him under a different kind of pressure. Each of his victories was not only personal success, but a tool of propaganda. The German press quickly turned Richthofen into a symbol. Numbers were repeated again and again. 80 victories were no longer just statistics. They were a message sent to allies and enemies alike in the sky. Germany remained in control. That pressure was not abstract. It demanded that Richthofen continue flying, continue fighting, continue winning, even as his body and mind grew exhausted. After each injury, instead of being withdrawn from the front, he was sent back into the air. No one said it openly, but everyone understood a symbol could not be allowed to disappear. In modern war, image could be as valuable as firepower. At the strategic level, another illusion gradually took hold: the belief that air combat alone could decide the outcome of the war. Some planners began to dream of air forces that would dominate the sky, sever supply lines, crush enemy morale, and force surrender. It was an appealing vision, because it promised a path less soaked in blood than the trenches. But the reality of the First World War did not allow it. Aviation technology was still too young. Range was limited. Payloads were small. Reliability was fragile. Aircraft could harass, could inflict damage, but they could not yet replace the power of infantry and artillery. Meanwhile, the Allies did not stand still. Every defeat became a lesson. French and British engineers rapidly found ways to neutralize Germany's advantage. Their own synchronization systems appeared. New tactics were developed: flying in formations, mutual protection, exploiting altitude and the sun. The imbalance that had once tilted the sky decisively to one side began to level out. And when it did, those accustomed to easy victories were forced to confront a far harsher reality. For Fokker, pressure turned into a vicious cycle. Each new improvement was expected to deliver a decisive edge, yet each edge was quickly copied or surpassed by the enemy. The race was no longer about innovation, but reaction. In such an environment, the line between intelligent advancement and dangerous compromise grew increasingly blurred. Aircraft became faster. Weapons grew more powerful. But machines also became more fragile. A single design flaw could mean a pilot never returned. Aerial warfare, once regarded as more noble than fighting on the ground, gradually lost its early romance. Personal duels became rarer as large squadrons filled the sky. The celebration of individual victories clashed with the reality that survival depended more and more on collective action. Pilots who clung to the image of the lone knight had to adapt or be eliminated. And it was in this phase that the true danger of illusion revealed itself. Technology did not grant absolute control. Reputa, there are moments in war that are not marked on maps or issued through official orders. They do not appear in operational plans, nor are they debated in the meeting rooms of general staffs. Yet it is precisely these moments that decide how history will be remembered. In the skies of the First World War, such moments often arrived quietly, carried by wind and engine noise, and compressed into a decision that lasted only a few seconds. For Manfred von Richthofen, the decisive moment did not arrive as a dramatic explosion, but as the logical continuation of who he had become. By the year 1917, Richthofen was no longer merely a skilled pilot. He was a living symbol. Every takeoff carried the weight of an entire system's expectations. He was no longer fighting only for his unit, but for an image Germany needed to preserve in a war that was increasingly turning against it. On those flights, Richthofen maintained his familiar style: no reckless pursuit, no unnecessary risk, always seeking superiority in altitude and position before attacking. Yet that very discipline began to clash with the new reality of air warfare. The sky was no longer the realm of rare, isolated duels. It had become crowded and chaotic, filled with overlapping squadrons, where the line between hunter and hunted grew thinner than ever. In this environment, every small decision carried greater weight. Chasing a target for too long could pull him away from protective formation. Dropping slightly lower to finish an opponent could place him within range of infantry fire from below. Breaking off early might preserve his life, but it also meant letting a victory slip away. There were no perfectly correct choices, only choices that were less dangerous at that particular moment. Richthofen understood this better than most. But he also understood that he was no longer entirely free to choose the safest path. The invisible pressure of reputation, expectation, and numbers repeated endlessly in the press narrowed his room for maneuver. Each refusal to engage, each early return, could be interpreted as a weakening of the legend. And a legend, once created, demands to be sustained. At the same time, in a different space altogether, Anthony Fokker faced his own decisive choices, even though he was not holding the control stick. His inventions had transformed the nature of air combat, but they also produced consequences he could not fully control. Each synchronization system installed was an affirmation of technical power, but also a step that pushed humanity farther away from aviation's original idea as a tool of observation and connection. Fokker was not a dreamer about war. He viewed aircraft as products, as systems, as machines that had to function efficiently. But once those machines were placed in the hands of young pilots ambitious and pressured from all sides, technology ceased to be neutral. It became a force that amplified human choice. A decision to pull the trigger, supported by precise mechanics, could end a life dozens of meters away. And with each such moment, the moral boundary of air warfare was pushed back a little further. Richthofen's decisive moment was not a single battle, but a sequence of times when he chose to keep flying when he could have stopped. After wounds, after warnings from doctors, after clear signs of physical exhaustion, he returned to the sky. No one forced him with a direct order. Yet no one gave him a reason strong enough to refuse. In a system that celebrated individual victory, his presence in the air became both a strategic and psychological necessity. On the Allied side, decisive moments unfolded in parallel, but in a different form. Once it became clear that matching technology alone was not enough, thinking began to change. Rather than hunting celebrated individuals, the focus shifted to collective tactics. Instead of seeking honorable duels, priority was given to effectiveness and survival. This was not a more noble choice, it was a more practical one in a war of attrition. The collision between these two approaches was inevitable. One side remained tied to the image of the night of the sky, with the individual at the center. The other increasingly treated air combat as part of a larger war machine, where the individual was only a link in the chain. When these worlds met, the decisive moment belonged not to a single person, but to the direction in which war itself would continue to move. In the brief seconds between detection and action, Richthofen, like so many other pilots, faced a question that was never spoken aloud: was continuing the pursuit worth the risk? And if the answer was no, would he still be the man an entire nation expected him to be? There was no time for extended reflection. The engine roared. The target remained ahead, and the choice, though never named, was made. When looked at later, that moment is often simplified into legend or tragedy. In reality, it was the result of accumulated. When a choice is made in the sky, its consequences rarely end when the engine falls silent or the wreckage hits the ground. In war, especially in the air war of the First World War, those consequences spread outward in widening circles, far beyond the fate of any single individual or isolated engagement. Decisions made in mere seconds above the clouds began to shape how human beings understood war, technology, and themselves for decades to come. For the pilots who survived, the change was immediate and profound. Air combat was no longer seen as a romantic adventure, but as a profession with a terrifying mortality rate. The young faces that once rose eagerly into the air now carried a more guarded expression. They learned to fly in tight formations, learned to break off rather than pursue, learned to accept that victory was not always measured by the number of aircraft destroyed, but by being alive to fly again the next day. The chivalric spirit did not vanish entirely, but it was forced to yield to the cold reality of industrialized war. At the unit level, the consequences appeared in shifts in tactics and organization. Squadrons no longer revolved around a single exceptional individual. They became flexible collectives, in which each pilot protected the others. The concept of the ace still existed in propaganda, but in operational reality, it was given less and less priority. The cost of relying too heavily on a single symbol had become painfully clear. When that symbol disappeared, the void left behind was not only psychological, but a tangible loss of combat capability. For the war machine as a whole, choices made in the air drove a broader process of reassessment. Planners came to understand that technology, while capable of delivering advantages, was never a final solution. Every improvement triggered a corresponding response from the enemy. Today's advantage became tomorrow's standard, and was soon surpassed. The race was no longer about finding a decisive victory, but about avoiding falling behind. In that context, air power was integrated more tightly with other forces, rather than being treated as an independent answer to the war. Over the long term, the impact of these choices extended far beyond the First World War. The lessons learned did not disappear when the guns fell silent. They were recorded in doctrine, in training manuals, and in the way later generations approached air warfare. Control of the sky became a central element of modern war. At the same time, the romanticization of individual heroism gradually gave way to systems thinking, in which human beings and machines were understood as components within a much larger network. For aviation technology, the consequences were revolutionary. The synchronization of machine guns did not merely change the First World War. It laid the foundation for every concept of the fighter aircraft that followed. From that point forward, aircraft design was inseparable from weaponry, no longer treated as two distinct elements. This led to rapid advances in aerodynamics, engines, materials, and pilot training. But it also locked military aviation onto a path that was difficult to reverse, one in which each new generation of aircraft was expected to deliver greater destructive capability than the last. At the human level, the consequences were even more complex. Pilots who returned from the war carried memories that civilian society could never fully grasp. They had once been celebrated as individuals, but in peacetime their roles faded into obscurity. Some found new purpose in civil or military aviation. Others never escaped the feeling that the decisions they had made in the sky had taken away a part of who they were. From the outside, the myth looked glorious. From within, it was often a lifelong burden. On the other side, For the families of those who did not return, the consequences held no strategic or historical meaning. They were pure loss. Decisions made in seconds had cut short lives that should have stretched far longer. In many cases, families never knew exactly what had happened in the sky that day. There was only a brief notification, a name on a list, and an absence nothing could fill. When the war ended, history began to reorganize everything into narrative. Complex choices were compressed into symbols. Deeply conflicted human beings were simplified into heroes or enemies. This made remembrance easier, but it also erased important nuances. Because what truly shaped the First World War in the air was not only victory counts, but a chain of imperfect decisions made by imperfect people, under conditions that denied them sufficient information or time. The ripple effects of those choices are still felt decades later. Every time a modern fighter aircraft takes off, carrying its finely integrated weapons, it still bears the imprint of decisions first made more than a century ago. And every time, people debate the role of the individual in high-tech. As the final engine sounds of the First World War slowly faded from the skies over Europe, there was no clear closing moment reserved for legends. There were no victory trumpets in the air, no solemn rituals set aside for those who had once ruled the sky. There was only silence spreading outward, a silence, unlike the tense pauses before combat, but the emptiness of an era that had just closed, leaving behind questions that were not easily answered. The aircraft once painted in vivid colors, once symbols of fear and dominance, gradually disappeared from the horizon. They were dismantled, replaced, or simply forgotten as technology moved forward with unforgiving speed. The pilots who survived returned to the ground, carrying memories of the sky as a place both familiar and distant. For them, the war did not end on Armistice Day. It continued in broken sleep, in sudden moments of looking upward, and instinctively listening for the sound of an engine. Engineers, the men behind inventions that had altered the course of the war, continued their work in a new world, where creativity was no longer driven by immediate survival. Drawings once rushed under wartime pressure were filed away, becoming references for later generations. Yet even as the context changed, the marks of wartime choices remained etched into every new design. Every fighter aircraft developed afterward carried within it the legacy of the moment when the sky was first accepted as a true battlefield. Legends, seen from the distance of time, grow quieter. The victory counts, once repeated as symbols of national pride, now exist only as data in history books. They lose their propagandistic weight, but reveal the human depth beneath. When the shell of myth peels away, what remains is not pure glory, but individuals forced to live with the consequences of choices made in moments that allowed no hesitation. In peacetime, the sky returns to being a space of movement and connection. Passenger aircraft cross routes that were once front lines. Travelers look out at slow drifting white clouds, rarely considering that at those very altitudes, human beings once learned how to kill one another more efficiently. This normalization is not a denial of history, but a sign that humanity can continue to live and move forward, even while carrying heavy memories. What remains after all? This is not a moral lesson carved in clear language. The history of air combat in the First World War does not ask us to praise or condemn in simple terms. It offers only an uncomfortable but necessary truth. Technology carries no meaning on its own, and legends do not create themselves. Both are born from human choices, made under conditions in which no option is perfect. When the legends fade, when names become little more than lines on a page, The true residue lies in how those choices continue to shape the world that follows. Each time people look to the sky, believing technology will protect them, the story of the Knights of the Sky whispers a reminder: power, no matter how high it flies, is always bound to human responsibility and human limits. And in that silence, history endures, not loudly, not in judgment, but patiently, waiting to be heard.